Queste scene sono dal Miami Open di tennis. Avevamo pianificato un viaggio per vedere Sinner, ma poco prima dell'inizio del torneo e ben dopo aver acquistato i biglietti, Sinner veniva sospeso dalla WADA per i fatti ormai noti. Sinner ha sempre sostenuto di non aver fatto nulla di irregolare. La maggior parte dei suoi colleghi la pensava allo stesso modo e tra coloro con il megafono più potente vi era la ex campionessa Martina Navratilova, che, come commentato per il Tennis Channel, non ha esitato a dire più volte che la WADA deve essere smantellata e ricostruita pezzo per pezzo. Ci sono ora buone probabilità che il desiderio della Navratilova venga realizzato. E questo perché ora anche le autorità americane ce l'hanno con la WADA. Ricordiamo che WADA sta per World Anti-Doping Agency ed è un'organizzazione internazionale indipendente fondata nel 1999 per promuovere, coordinare e monitorare la lotta contro il doping nello sport in tutto il mondo. Il 17 giugno di quest'anno, infatti, il sottogruppo per la Consumer Protection Technology and Data Privacy e parte della Commissione per il Commercio, Scienze e Trasporti ha tenuto un'udienza dal titolo WADA Shame, Swimming in Denial Over Chinese Doping, oppure La vergogna WADA, nuotare nella negazione sul doping cinese. L'obiettivo era di mettere in discussione il ruolo della WADA e non è la prima volta che viene organizzata un'udienza di questo tipo. In ogni occasione viene richiesta la presenza dei vertici della WADA, ma questi puntualmente snobbano le udienze. Avevamo previsto che questo comitato facesse riferimento al caso Sinner e così è stato. Però, prima di fare il sommario dell'intera udienza, ecco il segmento relativo al tennista italiano.
Mr. Tiger, I want to ask you about, I think it's Jannik Sinner and that case. And of course, that had to do with the International Tennis Integrity Agency, and they determined that there was a positive test for a banned steroid. And then they decided that Sinner bore no fault or negligence for the positive test. And then WADA, about a month later, announced that it would appeal that decision. And so you've got the athlete and WADA entering into a resolution that resulted in a 3-month ban. But it seems that WADA approached that very differently from how they approached the Chinese swimmers case. And I don't know if you have insight into why you think they would have approached these cases so differently.
It's impossible based on what we've seen to give even speculation of why they were approached so differently and what was so distressing and why you hear some of the world's top tennis players so outspoken about the unfairness now that they perceive in tennis was because how WADA treated this Sinner case, where they appealed it, rattled the sabers that it should be a 1 to 2 year suspension, and then on the eve of the hearing cut a deal with a very rarely used provision, and in their explanation attempted to say there were 67 other cases where they treated it similarly. We've went out and tried to find those cases and they're nowhere to be found. And so it raises once again this idea that WADA is unilaterally making decisions not in line with the transparency, the disclosure rules, which are absolutely mandatory. And I neglected to say it earlier, but make no mistake on the Chinese cases, even if there was contamination, Madam Chairwoman, they still had to announce those cases. They still had to disqualify those athletes. So there is no justifiable reason, these basic rules of transparency, even if it was contamination, which of course we don't believe that it was, and Cartier decided it wasn't necessarily proven, they still had to disclose them.
I want to ask you about something in your testimony. You said China has paid an extra $1.8 million. That's much more than their required dues, and they've done that since 2018, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And in 22, the Chinese earmarked $500,000 specifically for investigations in intelligence. And WADA turned a blind eye to every bit of this and allowed the Chinese swimmers to go ahead and come in. So do you believe there was a quid pro quo?
It's impossible to answer. However, what is clear is the perceived, at best case for WADA, the perceived conflict of, on the one hand, accepting, in addition to what you just mentioned, they have a private sponsorship with ATNA, the biggest Chinese, it's the Nike of China that also sponsors the Chinese swim team and the Chinese Olympic team. So they're getting extra gifts from China on the one hand, including the $500,000 you mentioned specifically for investigation effort. And then on the other hand, they don't apply the rules, even if you believed it was contamination to China, and don't even investigate the facts that came across their desk. So at a minimum, the perception of that is what's destroying the credibility in this system.
Well, indeed.
Le critiche che sono mosse alla WADA dalla Commissione americana sono le seguenti. 23 nuotatori cinesi sono risultati positivi ai controlli della China Anti-Doping Agency prima dei Giochi di Tokyo del 2021. La stessa organizzazione ha riportato i risultati come contaminazione da cibo dell'hotel e non ha penalizzato gli atleti. La WADA ha ignorato gli episodi e non ha preso alcun procedimento. La sostanza incriminata era la trimetazidina, o TMZ. Secondo la Commissione americana, per avere in corpo la quantità di TMZ trovata negli atleti cinesi, bisognava mangiare 5 kg di alimenti e bere circa 25 litri di acqua contaminata, il tutto il giorno precedente alla verifica. Difficile quindi credere all'ipotesi della contaminazione. Per la Commissione questo comportamento è costato 96 medaglie vinte dai cinesi a scapito degli atleti americani. Altra critica, la WADA non ha alcun organo che controlli il proprio operato e, come consuetudine, ignora ogni richiesta di chiarimenti. La WADA ha poi rimosso rappresentanti degli Stati Uniti dal proprio comitato esecutivo, apparentemente perché facevano troppe domande. Nonostante queste critiche, il Comitato Olimpico Internazionale, che nel frattempo ha assegnato i Giochi Olimpici invernali del 2034 a Salt Lake City, nello stato dello Utah, pretende che per l'occasione venga firmata una dichiarazione che riconosca l'autorità suprema della WADA. Con il clima attuale, siamo scettici che gli Stati Uniti siano disposti a trattare sull'argomento. Gli Stati Uniti inoltre ospiteranno i mondiali di calcio del 2026 e le Olimpiadi a Los Angeles nel 2028. In occasione di questi eventi casalinghi e con l'attuale amministrazione non vi è dubbio che gli organi competenti faranno di tutto per tutelare gli atleti americani. Il primo passo è stato di fermare i finanziamenti alla WADA, ovvero circa $3,5 milioni all'anno, che pone gli Stati Uniti come secondo contribuente dopo il Comitato Olimpico Internazionale. Se la WADA deciderà ancora di non collaborare, gli USA opereranno su tutti i canali diplomatici possibili. Inoltre giocheranno la carta della pubblicità, con inserzionisti come Comcast, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, che sembrano disposti ad investire solo con regole chiare. Da notare che lo scandalo dei nuotatori cinesi è esploso dopo un'indagine condotta dal New York Times. Lo stesso New York Times ha un precedente. Nel 2015 il quotidiano fu il primo a documentare le indagini condotte dalla FBI e dagli organi di controllo interni per procedure illegali condotte all'interno della FIFA. L'indagine portò alla fuoriuscita dei vertici dalla FIFA stessa. Esattamente il risultato che la Commissione americana si auspica per la WADA. E qui di seguito presentiamo la sintesi del dibattito.
Why it is completely implausible that the Chinese swimmers were unwittingly contaminated.
Thank you for the question, Senator Blackburn, and for your efforts, including the introduction of the Restore Confidence WADA Act that's before this subcommittee. Listen, I think we have attempted to get answers just as you all have to what really happened. We have seen what they've produced, which is very little. They appointed a very limited review of their own actions. And you don't have to take it from me. You can take it from what he determined. And he determined that they did not prove contamination and that it was just as plausible to be intentional use. You then couple that with the fact that WADA did no investigation, just blindly accepted the factual scenario that was provided by the Chinese. And in fact, months before these positive tests showed up on their desk, They had interviewed a defector, a whistleblower from China, who had indicated to them that TMZ was being given in a systemic fashion to athletes, but yet WADA leaders never brought in their independent investigative unit. They have a 16-person, very experienced investigative unit. They were not involved at all with investigating the facts of this case. TMZ is a prescription medication in some countries. It does not just show up in the kitchen. It's unbelievable to think that, Tinkerbell showed up and sprinkled it within the kitchen. The Chinese didn't find anyone using it. They didn't find it in the food. And the amount of food, the amount of contaminated drink you would have to actually eat or consume to get these levels was a few micrograms. I think we did the analysis based on the information that's out there. It's like 11 pounds of food and over, 7 gallons of liquid in order to get the levels. And to think that Chinese athletes at the top of their game are going to do that type of diet the day before an event or the day after one event before the next day's race is just absolutely ludicrous. And it's why we've asked for the questions. Why hasn't this followed the process and the protocols that are in place?
Let me ask you this, kind of following on to that. Why do you think that WADA thought they could intimidate the U.S. and the U.S. Olympic Committee and the Salt Lake City officials, and why was there a capitulation there?
Listen, I think it's what happened in Paris, I think you're referring to. I think it's Exhibit A of the value and the importance of independence in anti-doping enforcement. You have the perception that the IOC leveraged the giving of the Olympic Games in exchange for us bowing down, as Senator Cruz mentioned, to the supreme authority of WADA. Those shouldn't be commingled whatsoever. Now, we've been assured from the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee that it's meaningless. There was no quid pro quo in their mind, and we must give credit to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee because they did make the independent decision to create USADA. You've heard from some of the other witnesses about the effective model of independence. They took the courage back in late 1999, early 2000 to say we're gonna be involved to help fund, but we're not gonna be involved from a decision-making standpoint. We're gonna remove the fox from guarding the hen house here in the United States. And we think, and Professor Kohler testified to it, we think that's made all the difference in enforcement. And unfortunately, that's not what has happened and occurred with the IOC and with the World Anti-Doping Agency. I think the silver bullet to restoring trust is independence. They promised an independent president and vice president. They betrayed that promise. And that was part of why the US back in 2020 agreed to fund WADA, was making it more independent. That was in the legislative language to the funding that US taxpayers agreed to send to WADA. And that was supposed to go into effect, but they changed the rules mid-game. A bait and switch is what happened. I do firmly believe if you put in independent president and vice president on the executive committee, which then also means it's on the foundation board, they're the same people, then we can begin the process of ensuring that it's trustworthy, that it's transparent, has accountability, and change the culture so it's not a service or lapdog to sport, but is actually a dedicated, faithful servant to clean athletes.
I also think having the independent code compliance audits is important. I think make sure there's no conflicts of interest in the leadership of WADA is important. I think independent athletes representation is important. I think strengthening our oversight of it and having that representation. What I found is if we're not at the seat, we can't impact change. And we're about the most independent, and you've heard Katie talk about what US athletes do. And we want to make sure that everybody's doing it, first of all. But more importantly, we want to make sure that cheaters are not part of that system. And then, of course, engaging our corporate stakeholders and leveraging much more diplomatic channels. I think all of those things, we cannot give up our authority under the Rodchenkov Act to go after the entourage of bad actors. And that's where the supreme authority language kind of doesn't work for the United States when these games are coming to U.S., and we are so proud of those as well. Thanks.
We know WADA and their allies are going to fight this. As I said earlier, they've refused to come to the committee. They have refused to provide an explanation. I'm certain part of that is they don't want to be under oath and have to admit what is done. But Dr. Gupta, you've been somebody who made the decision to withhold those funds, and that was an impactful decision. And I want you to talk for the record for just a minute about why it is so important that Congress pass this legislation, give the ONDCP the permanent authority to oversee these funds, and then why it was important to withhold those funds.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Congress passed the authority. The first Trump administration gave us the authority to withhold. We exercised that for the right reasons. I think it's really important in legislation to ensure that ONDCP has that oversight authority to work in conjunction closely with USADA as well as the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic committees to ensure that American athletes are getting a level playing field. And only once that is done is we pay our dues. Of course, WADA isn't a favor of conditional dues payment because the argument is, well, every country will do that, but not every country is paying $3.6 million, and that's matched by IOC, which is over $7 million. So it's a large amount. I do think we have to have both the ability to withhold funds, but also appropriate representation on the governing bodies of WADA so we can hold folks accountable as well as address the bureaucratic aspects sometimes, as we saw with this scandal, that often becomes the reason for delaying or deferring or deflecting really incompetence and malfeasance.
Thank you.